and I actually want to now pick up a question that came in through the chat. And Connie Rice, I'm going to direct it to you because it builds directly off of what Jarrett was just saying. And it's interesting because I've heard both you, Angela and Stuart, reference, well, here we are again on the anniversary of, 5 years, 10 years, 15. And, I don't want to say having the same conversation, but it's when it becomes, part of the discourse, and it shouldn't just be around an anniversary, but, something that we talk about. And so the question here, it was actually posed this way, that soon enough that the people that are leading the conversation on the 92 uprising will be people who never lived through it. So how can we ensure that journalism is accurate and trustworthy for the future generations, and that they can have accurate conversations that contribute to the much needed policy changes that you all have been talking about?
I don't know that they can. The media, the terrain of journalism and the coverage of public issues is just so different. I mean, 30 years ago, there were maybe 5 newspapers. Newspapers have gone through this cannibalistic, pirate capitalism. They've just been shredded. And so all of the research capacity, I can remember, I would always go to the City Times section, the LA Times, not to pick on the LA Times, but there was the Daily News and the LA Times as the 2 sort of dominant papers. And the Times, to kind of answer these criticisms from community advocates like us, as well as from community-based papers that really did do the point of view of our different sets of diaspora communities, immigrant communities, indigenous communities. There were some organs, and then the LA Times did City Times, and that was the section of the paper that gave the point of view of mainly African American and Latino. I can't say that any of the Asian Pacific Island different sets of subcommunities were in. I can remember one article that included something about African Americans and Korean shop owners, but that went away. And now today there are more sections of the dominant papers for Hollywood, and yet they miss the Me Too. So as someone who does not participate in social media, I see an even more destructive set of physics to multiracial democracy, to building civic glue, to building bridges. We seem to have hatchets out for one another. And I don't think that I think the media is even less oriented toward building anything. It seems to just be wanting to survive. So for young journalists, I think you've got to fight. I think you've got to fight for the resources to cover these issues. I think you've got to fight to get the articles that cover both the conflicts as well as the emerging alliances in these communities, because they're not really of interest to people who are all about making money or about entertaining. And that seems to be the major focus. As the professor said, it's not about building multiracial democracy. It's not about building anything. It's about making money. And so when you have a journalist covering South Los Angeles and the violence, give the context to that. And I remember when Jill Leovy, I'll never forget having to go to the LA Times like Stuart did, and I said, there's an epidemic of youth gang homicides in South LA. There's an epidemic of gang homicides. There are 7,000 unsolved murders just in South Bureau. Where are the articles? And they said, murder's too common there to cover it. Wow. And that was when the journalist Jill Leovy wrote her book, Ghetto Side, about the fact that this community's trauma, deep trauma, and just as the Korean immigrant and Korean American trauma was never covered, it's still going on. I have conversations with my Korean American colleagues. The trauma is still there. The conversations between the African American community and the Black community haven't happened. We haven't healed that breach, that injury.
Mm.
And the leadership to do that, I don't think is helped by any of the coverage that you're going to get in any kind of mainstream media. I can't really answer that question, Monica. I just don't see a media terrain. And I'm not blaming the journalists, because the journalists, I think, have a very, very hard time now being able to cover substance in depth. It's constant content generation. It's 24 hours a day. Everything is shallow. There's no in-depth. I talked to journalists who haven't read the Christopher Commission report, the McCone Commission, the Colts Commission. They haven't read any of Joe Dominic's books on LAPD, and yet they're covering policing in this region. They don't even know that there are 44 police agencies. So I find that the resources for journalism, the support for journalists is getting thinner and thinner. And therefore, what we're talking about in terms of the kind of coverage that builds, I think is harder and harder.
So let me just open it up, Connie, thank you, to see if Jared or Stuart or Angela have anything they want to add or reaction to what you just heard. And I'm concerned about this notion of the parallel universe. And I remember I lived across the street from a woman who was on the editorial board for the LA Times. And she would say, you know, I pick up our paper in the morning, I pick up your paper, and I feel like I'm reading about two different cities. And how do we heal as a community? How do we overcome the trauma? How do we actually, you know, build those relationships that you all are talking about, understand the structural inequities that have led to the current circumstances? I'd love to hear. I see many of you came off mute. Angela, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, I thank you so much, Connie, for that perspective. I think that you're right on. I'm not sure we can. We're living in a time when there are so many different channels, and people can really just choose what they want to hear. And that's why we have the problem we have with the meta discourse that we see in the country. In fact, you know, how can masks be as controversial as they are? But they are. And it's a symptom of, you know, the fact that we don't seem to hold anything sacred anymore. I will tell you what I've been doing for the last 30 years. First, I did a lot of dialogue work, and you know, I've always said, wow, I'd like to write a book. And in fact, my goal was to get one done by the 30th. Well, that hasn't happened. So, but I have just seen so much that gives me hope, actually. Here in Southern Cal, we have something called the Black API Healing Circle. It was intended for us to just meet 4 times. I was going to do some training with some colleagues up north and here, Lady Bird Morgan and Orland Bishop and Sean Evans, and we wanted to put together a space where we could just hold people in whatever it was that they needed to compost with regard to the Black Asian tensions and conflicts. We were only going to do 4 and train people to go out and do more circles. We've been meeting now for 2 years, and you know, through COVID, and the relationship is so deep. We can cry with one another. We can express deep anger and regret about things. And now we're seeing that there are more people that are needing this kind of space. So that's one thing. Another thing is we have to stay connected to the reality that things aren't the same as they were 30 years ago. So whatever I have to say about what I did, it really isn't relevant to what needs to happen going forward. But I'm a big one that believes that, you know, the past, we don't forget it. We carry it in who we are. It's in our bones. The future is just an imagination, and that's what Hollywood does very well, and it can make all kinds of stories up. I don't think it's a mistake that the narrative form, by the way, has become so popular in every sector where people are doing narratives. Why? Because they're not getting the depth and the texture and the thoughtfulness. And I see it all as very tied to education failing in this country. We've lost our ability to think critically, I think, because we're so used to having been conditioned to become consumers. That's what we do. We consume things, ideas, and information. But where is the thinking of anything original, creative? And then where is the kindness? You know, everything is about a fight, a win or a lose. I'm looking for people who want to develop their capacity to be kind again and to be generous in a time of scarcity and fear. and violence, frankly. I feel for this man who's just been picked up. It was a horrible thing that happened in Brooklyn, and yet it's clear to me there's mental disability here. There's a mental illness, and we went and unfunded all of our community mental health clinics during the Reagan administration. We are living with the impact of that now.
Jarrett, I saw you came off mute. Do you want to?
I mean, we could talk about this for 3 days, right? Like, I mean, there's plenty of it to talk about here. One of the things that I think is really important, and I'll preface this by saying I just became a college professor, so Constance, when you referenced me as the professor, I was like, who is she talking about? And it's like, I'm still getting used to that. But one of the things that when I was reaching out to friends, talking to them about maybe taking this job, and getting their feedback on why you should definitely do it, was they were like, oh, the students will keep you young. And I'm like, I mean, I feel like I'm pretty young. I'm doing all right, you know. But talking with the students now, I'm always intrigued by their perspective and the way that they are social justice empowered and educated. And also, though, they have a kindness and a compassion that surprises me, that I didn't feel like I saw when I was growing up. But we also have to recognize, like, these are students who have lived through Donald Trump as president, right? Who have lived through COVID, who have lived through the 2016 election and how that whole thing went. They've lived through Barack Obama being the first Black president of the United States. And so they have a lens that is different than the lens I had when I was in college, right? And so I think that to your question about, like, what do we do? I think part of what we need to be thinking about is, how do we always make sure that we're bringing the history to the contemporary, right? I've been really fascinated by the students' questions about the ways that things work. And I make sure that when we're talking about the television system, right now I'm teaching an entertainment and pop culture class. And when we're talking about the entertainment system or television or film or whatever it is, we always make sure that we have a conversation about the ways that race play in that space, right? And one of my students was like, I love that we're talking about critical race theory. And I was like, that's not even, girl, no, right? Like, I'm just talking about race, right? And how race impacts these conversations. And I think that when we continue to do that, and when we continue to be thoughtful about what we're centering in our conversation, I think we can also start to have an impact on being able to shift people's ideas, to make people just think an extra moment, to have a little bit more of a thought process around the stories that we're telling, the ways that we're telling those stories, the words that we're using, and the ones that we're not, right? The things that we're centering in on and the things that we're not paying attention to. And I say we to include me, right? Because, like, I'm trying to be better about all of it, but I think we all have a lot of work to do to be able to change this system, because in reality, getting this system to be what we need it to be may be impossible, right? But I think we can do a lot of work to try to make it better.
Really appreciate what you said about talking about race. Go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, I wanted to make a few points. One is, I agree that newspapers and the media are under a lot of pressure, but I think it's very important for people in this webinar to uphold what we think needs to happen, what we expect from the media, what we expect to uphold multiracial democracy. Otherwise, we're lost. Because if we just let everything fall apart, then we really are lost. So we have to uphold what our goals should be with regards to what we expect the media to perform. If they could cover the Ukraine left and right, they could cover our communities as well. The other thing I just wanted to say is, this is a time that really pushes the need for ethnic studies, because the media may not cover the true histories of our communities. So in addition to working with advancing justice, I'm working with the Asian American Education Project. And we're finding a huge hunger around the country where our curriculum of 53 lesson plans is in 10 states already. And we're working on stories not only about Asian Americans, but how Asian Americans have worked with Black Americans, have worked with Latinx. Recently, I was given a Lifetime Achievement Award at MALDEF's dinner. And I told this story about how Filipino American farm workers joined with the Mexican American farm workers to start the UFW, the United Farm Workers. And people love that story. People are hungry for the truth about what has happened in our communities.